Greetings and welcome to week 1 of Scientific Research Methodology MOOC. In this section of M1.4, we will have a look at the elements of research methodology. With the background knowledge about the type of research, what the research process entails, and how that process should be carried out ethically, let us now focus on the elements of research methodology which need to be considered while planning a research study. These elements must be addressed while writing an outline of a research project for academic purpose and for writing a research proposal for a research grant. These are research problem, hypothesis, variables, experimental design, and data documentation and analysis. In this section of part 1, we will be focusing on research problem, hypothesis, and variables. The research problem, as mentioned earlier, could be compared to the heart of the entire research study, as all the next processes of the research would be centered around it. Formulating the research problem is, of course, the very first step that a researcher would take. The type of question that a researcher would like to pursue and find its solution would classify the research study into the specific type of research that we have already discussed in the earlier section. This is a very important feature, as based on the type of research, the researcher will have to plan the further action. The research problem could originate from an interesting or a peculiar phenomenon that has been observed, or a validation of some theory that has already been existing, or finding a solution to a problem that exists and needs an urgent solution. While choosing the research problem, the researchers could take into consideration some of the following essential issues, such as the required expertise to carry out the research methods, availability of literature to understand the background research. Formulating the research problem calls upon a great deal of prior literature survey that needs to be undertaken by the researcher. The rationale behind choosing that particular research problem, the availability of resources, time, and funding, the ethical guidelines as applicable. The research problem should not be very broad, such that the focus area is not very clear, and at the same time it should not be very narrow, which would not give much scope for an extensive data to be available in order to draw out specific conclusions at the end. A well-defined research problem with specific objectives leads to developing a good research plan, as it gives a clarity of thought, which is an important attribute for a steady progress of the research study. Let us consider the next element of research methodology, that is hypothesis, which in simple words means an assumption. We do it all the time in our everyday life. Let me give you an example of a situation wherein when you come back home, you find the door of your house, as you can see in this picture, yes, partially opened. I would request you to please pause the video and write what would come to your mind when you would see this. Thank you. Some of you might have immediately be in doubt that maybe while leaving you did not lock it properly. Some of you might also get alarmed that what if someone has tried opening it with a motive like robbery? Some of you might have written that it could be someone from your family who also has the key and has reached before you and has left it ajar. Some of you might have even thought that probably the lock has got defective and may have opened on its own. So, these are the assumptions that are based on the evidence that is in front of you of a partially open door, and maybe you are also relating it with the previous similar event that might have occurred. There is definitely some logical reasoning for you to make any of these assumptions that have been discussed, and thus you would accordingly take further course of action to check if whatever that you have thought is actually what it is. A researcher too does the same. Once the research problem has been finalized, he or she starts making assumptions, that is framing the hypothesis. Say for example, while studying the pharmacokinetics, the hypothesis could be made that a particular drug under preparation is assumed to inhibit the bacterial growth of a particular disease-causing strain. Here, the hypothesis could also be called a prediction, where the researcher is expecting a favorable result. But as this is not for sure, he or she will have to start devising the further research plan to prove this or disapprove of this. Therefore, we can say that framing the hypothesis sets the guideline for developing the research plan. The literature review done during the framing of the research problem serves as the basis for setting of the hypothesis. The hypothesis should point towards new dimensions of exploring the facts, maybe of the earlier research done, or an altogether new question that needs to be addressed through the research problem to be undertaken. Also, the statement of the hypothesis should be such that it is lucid enough for all those who are associated with this research endeavor. A single hypothesis should not have too many propositions, as that may lead to confusion for developing a concrete research plan. We will revisit this section after discussing the next element of research methodology, the variables, as these are very closely related to the testing of hypotheses so framed.